You're working more but falling behind. It feels almost normal now to say you are busy all the time. Messages left unread, weekends that feel too short, and weekdays that blur into one long cycle of work and recovery. But here is the strange part: people are working more hours than ever before, staying more connected than ever before. And yet many still feel like they are falling behind financially. It creates a quiet contradiction where effort is clearly increasing, but progress does not feel the same. If hard work alone was still the guaranteed path forward, this pattern would not exist. Something has shifted in how work translates into reward, and it is not always obvious at first glance. The workload has grown, expectations have expanded, and productivity tools have made everything faster. But the outcome for many people feels strangely unchanged. That is where the real question begins: what exactly changed in the relationship between time, effort, and money? Longer working hours becoming the norm. Work hours used to feel more structured, something that began and ended within a predictable frame. Now, for many people, that boundary has become less clear. Emails arrive outside traditional hours, tasks spill into evenings, and weekends often feel like a delayed extension of the work week. It is not always about a single job demanding more time, but about the overall culture slowly normalizing constant availability. The result is a lifestyle where being off does not fully feel like being off anymore. What makes this shift interesting is how gradual it has been. There was no single moment where everyone agreed to work more hours. Instead, it happened through small adjustments over time: increased expectations, faster communication, tighter deadlines, and more tools that make staying connected easier. Each change on its own seemed reasonable, even helpful, but together they created a new baseline where longer working hours feel less like an exception and more like the default. This change also affects how people perceive productivity. Being available longer is often confused with being more productive, even when output does not necessarily increase in the same proportion. The line between presence and performance becomes blurred, and time spent working starts to matter as much as actual results. That shift subtly changes how effort is measured in everyday life. At the same time, there is a social layer to this normalization. When everyone around you appears to be constantly busy, it creates pressure to match that pace. Even without formal requirements, the environment itself pushes longer engagement. It becomes less about direct instructions and more about unspoken expectations that shape behavior over time. The challenge is not just the number of hours, but how those hours reshape energy, focus, and long-term balance. When extended work becomes routine, recovery time shrinks, and the feeling of constant motion increases. And that is where many people start noticing that despite working more, the sense of progress does not always increase alongside it. Stagnant wages over time. There is a common expectation that as time passes and experience grows, income should naturally rise in a noticeable way. But for many people, that expectation does not match reality. Wages often increase slowly, and in some cases, they barely move for long periods. Even with additional responsibilities, improved skills, or longer tenure, the financial change can feel smaller than expected. This creates a gap between effort invested and reward received over time. Part of this comes from how compensation structures are designed. Salary adjustments are often influenced by broader economic conditions, organizational budgets, and market comparisons. This means that even when individual performance improves, the overall increase may not reflect that growth directly. It becomes a system where progress exists, but not always in a linear or visible way. Another important aspect is how time affects perception. When people compare their current income to where they were several years ago, the difference might exist, but it does not always feel significant enough to match the additional experience gained. This can create a sense of stagnation, even when small increases are happening in the background. What adds to this feeling is the rising baseline of expectations. As life progresses, responsibilities increase and financial needs evolve. What once felt like a comfortable income may start to feel tighter, even if the number has grown slightly. This creates a situation where wage growth and lifestyle demands do not always move in sync. It is also important to understand that wage growth varies widely across industries and roles. Some fields experience faster increases, while others move more slowly due to structural limitations. This uneven pattern contributes to the perception that overall progress is inconsistent, even when individual cases differ. The key realization here is that income growth is not just about time spent working, but about how value is recognized within a system. Once that becomes clear, it is easier to understand why effort alone does not always lead to proportional financial movement over long periods. Inflation outpacing income. One of the most subtle forces affecting financial progress is inflation, because it does not appear as a direct loss, but as a gradual reduction in what money can actually do. Even when income increases slightly, the cost of goods and services often rises alongside it, sometimes faster than expected. This creates a situation where earnings may look better on paper, but feel less powerful in daily life. What makes inflation difficult to notice in real time is its gradual nature. Prices do not jump dramatically in a single moment. Instead, they increase in small steps over time, affecting groceries, transportation, rent, and basic necessities. Each change might feel minor on its own, but together they reshape the overall cost structure of everyday living. This means that even if someone receives periodic salary increases, those adjustments may simply be keeping pace rather than creating real improvement. The feeling of progress becomes muted because gains are absorbed by rising expenses almost immediately. Over time, this can create the impression of standing still financially despite continued effort. Another important factor is how inflation affects different areas unevenly. Some costs rise faster than others, which means the pressure is not distributed equally across all aspects of life. Housing and essential services often carry more weight, making them key drivers of financial strain for many individuals. This dynamic changes how people think about income growth. It is no longer enough to focus only on how much is earned, but also on how much that income can actually purchase. The gap between nominal income and real value becomes increasingly important in understanding financial stability. Once inflation is seen as a constant background force rather than a temporary condition, it becomes easier to interpret financial changes more accurately. It shifts attention from raw numbers to actual purchasing power, which is where the real impact is felt over time. Rising living expenses. Daily life has become more expensive in ways that are not always immediately obvious. It is not just one area that is changing, but multiple categories at the same time: housing, food, transportation, utilities, and services, all gradually increasing in cost. Individually, these changes may seem manageable, but together, they create a noticeable shift in overall financial pressure. Housing is often one of the most significant contributors to this rise. Whether renting or owning, the cost associated with living space has increased in many regions, taking up a larger portion of income than before. This naturally leaves less room for savings, investments, or discretionary spending, even if earnings remain stable. Everyday expenses also play a major role. Small increases in food prices, fuel costs, and basic services accumulate over time. These are the kinds of changes that are easy to adjust to individually, but harder to ignore when viewed collectively. They slowly reshape what a normal budget looks like. Another factor is how modern lifestyles introduce new recurring expenses. Digital subscriptions, services, and convenience-based spending add layers to monthly financial commitments. While each one may seem small, together they contribute to a higher baseline cost of living. This environment makes financial planning more complex, because stability is not just about income, but about how quickly expenses evolve. Even consistent earnings can feel stretched when the cost structure underneath continues to rise. Understanding this helps explain why financial pressure can increase even without major life changes. It is not always about earning less, but about spending more on the same standard of living over time. Productivity increasing without higher pay. One of the most noticeable shifts in modern work is how much more productive people have become compared to previous generations. Technology, automation tools, faster communication systems, and improved workflows have all contributed to higher output in less time. Tasks that once took hours can now be completed in minutes, and entire processes have been streamlined significantly. However, this increase in productivity does not always translate directly into higher pay. In many cases, the gains are absorbed into efficiency improvements rather than individual compensation. The system becomes faster and more capable, but the distribution of benefits does not always change at the same pace. This creates a disconnect between output and reward. What makes this situation more complex is that higher productivity often leads to higher expectations. When systems become more efficient, the standard for performance also rises. This means that even though more is being achieved, it quickly becomes the new normal rather than a reason for increased compensation. Another aspect is how productivity is measured. In many roles, output improvements are difficult to quantify in ways that directly influence pay structures. This creates a gap between actual contribution and financial recognition, especially in environments where compensation does not automatically adjust with efficiency gains. Over time, this dynamic can create a feeling that effort is constantly increasing without a matching return. It is not necessarily about working harder in a traditional sense, but about working within systems that have become more demanding without restructuring how value is distributed. Recognizing this shift is important because it changes how productivity is viewed. It is no longer just about doing more, but about understanding how that more is valued within a larger system that does not always adjust in real time. The cost of housing skyrocketing. Housing used to feel like something you planned for once in a while, a long-term goal you slowly worked toward. But in many places today, it feels like the goalposts keep moving further away no matter how fast you try to approach them. Rent rises, property prices climb, and even basic living spaces that were once considered affordable start to feel out of reach. It is not always a sudden jump that shocks people, but a steady increase that quietly reshapes what normal even means in terms of cost. What makes this shift so impactful is how unavoidable housing is. You can cut back on many expenses, but shelter is not optional. So when housing costs rise, they automatically take priority in every financial decision. This creates a chain reaction where other parts of life have to adjust around it. Savings shrink, flexibility reduces, and long-term planning becomes harder because a larger share of income is already committed before anything else is considered. Another layer to this is how location has become a major factor in affordability. Cities and even smaller urban areas are experiencing different levels of pressure, but the general trend is upward. People often find themselves choosing between living closer to opportunities or choosing more affordable space farther away, each option carrying its own trade-offs in time, money, and quality of life. What is interesting is how quickly expectations adapt. A price that once felt extreme gradually becomes the new reference point. Over time, people adjust their understanding of what housing should cost, even if it feels heavy compared to past standards. That slow shift makes the change less noticeable in the moment, even though the long-term impact is significant. This rising cost does not just affect where people live, it influences how they plan their lives. Decisions about career moves, family planning, and financial goals all become tied to housing affordability in one way or another. It becomes more than an expense, it becomes a central factor shaping life direction. And once you see how strongly housing affects everything else, it becomes clear why financial pressure feels so persistent for many people, even without drastic changes in income. Debt eating into earnings. Debt often starts quietly, as a tool that helps manage big expenses or bridge financial gaps when needed. At first, it feels manageable, just another part of modern financial life. But over time, it begins to take a consistent share of income, turning monthly earnings into something that is partially already spoken for before it even arrives. This reduces flexibility and changes how financial decisions are made on a daily basis. What makes debt particularly impactful is how routine it becomes. Payments are scheduled, automatic, and expected. which means a portion of income is continuously redirected without active thought each time. This creates a structure where financial freedom is reduced not by a single event, but by ongoing commitments that quietly shape spending capacity month after month. Another important factor is how debt can accumulate from different directions at the same time. It is not always a single loan or obligation, but often a combination of credit, education costs, housing payments, or personal borrowing. Each one may seem reasonable on its own, but together they form a significant portion of total earnings that cannot be freely used elsewhere. Over time, this reduces the ability to respond to unexpected changes. When a large part of income is already allocated, even small financial disruptions can feel more impactful. This creates a sense of constraint, where decisions are influenced not just by income level, but by how much of that income is already committed before it arrives. What is often overlooked is how normalized this structure has become. Many people grow into financial systems where debt is already present, so it does not feel unusual. It becomes part of the background of financial life rather than something actively questioned. But its long-term effect is what slowly reshapes financial independence. Understanding this helps clarify why earnings do not always feel as flexible as expected. It is not just about how much is earned, but how much is already allocated before any personal choices are made. Multiple jobs just to stay afloat. There was a time when a single full-time job was generally expected to cover basic living costs and provide stability. Today, for many people, that expectation has shifted. One source of income is often not enough to comfortably manage rising expenses, leading individuals to take on additional work just to maintain balance. This is not always about ambition or growth, but often about necessity. What makes this situation challenging is how it changes the structure of daily life. Time becomes divided across different responsibilities, leaving less space for rest, personal development, or long-term planning. The focus shifts from building ahead to simply keeping up with current demands. This creates a cycle where effort increases, but forward progress feels limited. Another aspect is how multiple jobs affect energy and consistency. Switching between roles, environments, or tasks requires mental adjustment, which can reduce overall efficiency over time. Even though total working hours increase, the quality of focus can become harder to maintain across everything at once. At the same time, this approach reflects how adaptable people have become in response to financial pressure. Taking on additional work is often a practical solution to immediate needs, and it demonstrates resilience in the face of changing conditions. But it also highlights how much extra effort is required to achieve what used to be possible with a single income source. What is important to recognize is that this is not just an individual experience, but a broader trend in many places. The rise of side work, freelance tasks, and gig-based income reflects a shift in how people structure their financial lives. It shows how income has become more distributed rather than concentrated in one place. This changes the definition of stability itself. Instead of relying on one consistent source, many people now build stability through multiple smaller streams. And while that offers flexibility, it also requires constant management and attention. Burnout and declining well-being. When work becomes more demanding, more constant, and more spread across different responsibilities, the impact is not only financial, but also personal. Over time, the combination of long hours, rising expectations, and financial pressure can lead to a gradual decline in overall well-being. It does not happen suddenly, but builds slowly through continuous strain without enough recovery. Burnout is not just about being tired. It is about a deeper exhaustion that affects motivation, focus, and even the ability to feel fully present. When energy is consistently spent on maintaining work and financial stability, there is less left for rest, relationships, or personal interests. This imbalance gradually affects how people experience everyday life. What makes this more complex is that modern work environments often reward constant availability. Being responsive and engaged is seen as a strength, but over time it can blur the line between healthy involvement and overextension. The expectation to always stay connected adds pressure that does not always leave space for recovery. At the same time, people often push through this phase because it feels necessary. Responsibilities do not pause, expenses do not reduce, and commitments continue. So even when signs of exhaustion appear, they are often managed rather than addressed, which allows the cycle to continue longer than it ideally should. This creates a situation where well-being becomes something secondary to productivity. Physical and mental health are still valued, but they are often adjusted around work demands rather than placed alongside them equally. Over time, this imbalance becomes more noticeable in how people feel day to day. Understanding burnout in this context helps explain why increased effort does not always lead to improved outcomes. Without balance, productivity may rise in the short term, but sustainability becomes harder to maintain. Job insecurity and layoffs. Even in stable industries, the idea of long-term job security has become less certain than it once was. Economic changes, restructuring, and evolving business models mean that roles can shift or disappear faster than before. Layoffs are no longer seen as rare events, but as something that can happen even in companies that appear successful on the surface. What makes this uncertainty impactful is how it affects long-term planning. When stability feels less guaranteed, decisions about spending, saving, and career growth become more cautious. People begin to consider not just current income, but how secure that income feels over time. This changes how financial choices are made at every level. Another factor is how quickly industries are evolving. Technology, automation, and global competition all influence how companies operate, which in turn affects employment structures. Roles that were once considered stable may evolve or reduce in importance as businesses adjust to new conditions. This creates an environment where adaptability becomes increasingly important. At the same time, job insecurity is not always visible until it becomes immediate. Most of the time, work continues normally, which can create a false sense of stability. But behind the scenes, decisions are often influenced by factors that employees may not directly see, such as market performance or strategic changes. This does not mean instability is constant, but it does mean certainty is less absolute than before. Understanding this helps explain why many people approach careers differently today, focusing more on flexibility and skill development rather than relying solely on long-term placement in one role. Recognizing this shift allows for a more realistic view of work. It highlights the importance of adaptability in a system where change is becoming more frequent, even when everything appears stable on the surface. The cost of housing skyrocketing. Housing used to be something people slowly worked toward, a long-term milestone that felt challenging but achievable with time and stability. But in many places today, it feels like the target keeps moving further away the moment you think you are getting closer. Prices rise faster than expectations. Rent increases become a regular conversation, and even modest living spaces start to feel like major financial commitments. It is not always a dramatic jump that people notice instantly, but a consistent upward pressure that quietly reshapes what affordability even means. What makes this shift so powerful is that housing is not optional. No matter how much costs rise, everyone still needs a place to live, which means a large portion of income gets locked into this one category first. Once that happens, everything else has to adjust around it. Savings become harder to build, investments get delayed, and even basic financial flexibility starts to shrink. It is not just about higher prices, it is about how those prices redefine the structure of an entire budget. Another layer is how expectations change over time. What once felt expensive slowly becomes the new normal, and people adapt to it because they have to. A rent price that seemed unrealistic a few years ago eventually becomes something people accept as standard. That adjustment happens quietly, without a clear moment of realization, which is why the long-term impact often feels heavier than the short-term change. Location also plays a huge role in this pressure. Cities with more opportunities tend to have higher housing costs, which forces people into difficult trade-offs. Either they pay more to stay close to work and opportunity, or they move farther away and sacrifice time and convenience. Neither option feels ideal, and both come with hidden costs that go beyond just money. Over time, housing stops being just an expense and becomes a central factor that influences career decisions, lifestyle choices, and long-term planning. It quietly shapes the direction of life more than most people realize in the moment. And once you see how deeply housing affects everything else, it becomes clear why financial pressure feels constant, even when income does not change drastically. If this made you rethink what working hard really means today, make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss deeper breakdowns like this. Drop a comment and share your thoughts, because this is something most people feel but rarely talk about openly. Stay aware, stay sharp, and start looking at work not just as effort, but as a system you need to understand.